Hi, I'm Thomas Broadhead. I am the editor of the Critical Performance edition of the Ives Fourth Symphony. And in this video, I'm going to be discussing an edit to the saxophone part that I wouldn't have realized would be helpful to the player had I not been present for a rehearsal during which the saxophone player approached me and said, you know, there's an issue here, and there's a solution I would propose. And I was grateful to receive this information, and I think it's benefited saxophone players ever since. So let's take a look at the part. So here is a page from the saxophone part. Saxophone only plays in the second movement of the symphony, but Ives calls for two instruments. He calls for the tenor saxophone and for the baritone saxophone, never to be played at the same time, but in alternation. So it could be done by one player who switches between the two instruments, or if you happen to have two players, great. You could have two players, one for each instrument. I've actually seen a performance where they had two players, one for each saxophone. That was with the old 1965 score, though. What happens in the part to keep track of which instrument is playing in a given passage, always the name of the instrument in question is presented at the beginning of the passage, and then especially following a page turn. So here in a box, you see B-flat tenor sax. So it shows that this passage is to be played by that instrument. And then again, there's been a rest of three measures here, but tenor sax continues. So once again, it's stated explicitly, tenor sax, right? Down here, Ives indicates that he wants the baritone sax to play. So here in a box is E-flat baritone sax. Now, there is an alternate notation provided at rehearsal 10, and that's because the music here is complicated by the fact that it's all set off by an eighth rest, and Ives is writing across the bar line and so on. So if you were to play it on the beat, it would be dun 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 and so on. But it's set off by an eighth rest, so it's bum 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 and so on. And this measure in particular becomes quite hairy. So I provided it, two ways: the original notation and then Ives's, which is on top because it's probably the one the player will execute, but also this alternate notation, which I think is essential to be able to figure out how to execute these tricky, triplets within the offbeat. So at the Concertgebouw, the saxophone player approached me and said, "There's a problem with my part, and it's this. There's not enough time for me to switch from tenor sax to baritone sax between rehearsal 11 and then when the baritone sax comes in at measure 62. And she said, but this passage could be played on baritone sax, and there is enough time for me to switch from tenor to baritone here at rehearsal 9 because the tempo is quite slow, and that means that there's a lot of time there for the switch. So would it be possible for me to play this part on baritone here?" And I thought, well, yeah, let's do that. So I wrote out a renotation of it for baritone so she could execute it. But I realized that this needed to be corrected in the part itself. I didn't want to just change the whole thing over to baritone sax because Ives wrote it for tenor. So it needed to be presented two ways: once for tenor sax and then for baritone sax, with an explanation for why there are two presentations of the material. So in the revised part, it looks like this. The entire passage at rehearsal 10 consumes the page because I'm having to present both versions, one for tenor and one for baritone, and the alternate notations. So that eats up a lot of real estate on the page, but that's not the issue. The issue is to get the notes there and make it playable for the readers of the part. And at the top of the page, I include a note explaining what's going on here. I write, "The change in tempo from measure 59 through 62 may make it difficult to switch from tenor to baritone saxophone. Therefore, if there is only one player for the two instruments, it may be desirable to play the passage from measure 55 through 59 on baritone saxophone, so no change of instrument is required at measure 62. Below, the music for measures 55 through 59 is presented twice, once for tenor saxophone, top staff, and a second time for baritone saxophone, bottom staff. Play one, not both. If two players are available, tenor saxophone should be used for this passage." Tenor is what Ives indicated. So that was the revision that I made after I returned from my experience with the players at the Concertgebouw. And the first use of the revised part was actually the following spring in April of 2013. And the player at the New York Philharmonic and I spoke, and I asked him about this page, and he said, well, when I turned to page 4 and I saw, this weird notation, I was a little concerned, but then after I read the text at the top, it all made sense. And he then went on to explain that he didn't have any difficulty switching between instruments, that going from tenor to baritone between 55 and then later on at 62 wasn't an issue for him, but he did understand the concern, and he said that, for some players, it may be tricky to do it. And also the fact is, we have no control over what the actual tempo will be here. It's indicated to be 88 to 92, but a conductor might rush it up to 120 or something, in which case these two measures of rest just fly by. So again, this was an edit that I would never have considered had I not been present to interact with players and get real-world feedback from them.